Canada will not accept a bad deal. We want a good deal, not a fast deal. Those weren't off-the-cuff remarks. They were deliberate, surgical warnings from Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, delivered in a week where the stakes couldn't be higher. As the White House circled August 1st with a pen ready to slash 35% tariffs across steel, autos, and timber, Carney stood his ground, not with fury, but with finality. In Washington, the reaction was volcanic. Furious tweets, tanking markets, and the sound of trade advisors scrambling to recalibrate. For decades, the U.S. assumed Canada would fall in line. But what happens when the neighbor says, no deal is better than a bad one? For much of the 20th and early 21st centuries, the economic bond between the United States and Canada was not just strong, it was foundational. As the world's largest bilateral trading relationship, over $2 billion worth of goods crossed the border every single day. The 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and later its successor, the USMCA, institutionalized decades of integration. American factories depended on Canadian aluminum and steel, Canadian car makers thrived on U.S. consumer demand and cross-border supply chains. The border, once a line on a map, became a bridge for jobs, capital, and shared prosperity. Yet, even the most time-honored relationships are vulnerable to stress. The first cracks appeared during Donald Trump's first term, when tariffs were wielded not as policy tools, but as political threats. Steel and aluminum tariffs in 2018 triggered shockwaves. Canada responded with retaliatory measures, marking one of the few times the two allies faced off in an economic standoff. Though tensions cooled under the Biden administration, lingering mistrust remained, especially around disputes over softwood lumber, dairy quotas, and digital services. Then came 2025. Faced with falling approval ratings and mounting economic pressures, Trump, now a presidential candidate once again, doubled down on trade nationalism. When he floated a 35% tariff wall on Canadian imports unless a new Fair Trade Pact was signed by August 1st, it wasn't just an ultimatum. It was a challenge to Canada's sovereignty and a reignition of old tensions. But Canada had changed too. No longer the quiet junior partner, it had begun investing in its own national capacity, rethinking its dependencies, and preparing, quietly, for a moment just like this. This wasn't just about trade anymore. It was about identity, leverage, and the cost of saying no. On July 8, 2025, in a campaign rally outside Pittsburgh, Donald Trump stepped to the podium and dropped a trade bombshell. Starting August 1st, we will impose a 35% tariff on Canadian steel, autos, and lumber, unless we get a real deal that puts America first. The crowd roared, but behind the scenes in Washington, alarm bells went off. This wasn't just political theater. It was a resurrection of an economic playbook that many economists believed had already failed: punitive tariffs as leverage for forced concessions. The Trump team, facing a slowing economy and inflation backlash, needed a win that looked bold and muscular. Targeting Canada, an ostensibly safe adversary, offered the appearance of action, without the geopolitical risk of targeting China or Europe. Privately, administration officials defended the move as necessary. Trade Representative Kevin McCarthy described the Canadian supply chain as outdated, protectionist, and riddled with subsidies. Trump's senior economic advisor claimed, "We've been giving them a free ride for decades. This is about fairness." But others within the administration warned of collateral damage. The Yale Budget Lab projected the tariffs could shave 0.9 percentage points off U.S. GDP in 2025 and cost up to 600,000 jobs. The Federal Reserve expressed concern over price shocks in construction, auto manufacturing, and consumer goods, where Canadian materials play a key role. Still, Trump pressed forward. What truly raised eyebrows was the arbitrary deadline. August 1st wasn't tied to any treaty expiration. court ruling, or supply disruption. It was a political line in the sand designed to force Canada's hand while giving Trump a headline. He reportedly told advisors, "If they blink, I win. If they fight, I'll crush them with tariffs." The strategy ignored decades of economic interdependence. Canada wasn't just another exporter. It was America's largest trading partner, military ally, and neighbor. But Trump, ever the dealmaker, treated trade like a reality TV showdown. Markets reacted swiftly. Steel and auto stocks slumped. Construction firms, already facing high interest rates, warned of layoffs. U.S. automakers feared cost spikes and delays, as 23% of their input parts were sourced from Canadian suppliers. Consumer groups predicted price hikes across the board, from cars to furniture to home renovations. And yet, the administration doubled down. On July 20th, Trump's campaign released an ad. "Joe Biden bows to globalists. Donald Trump defends you." The messaging was clear: strength, nationalism, and zero compromise. But in targeting Canada, Trump may have overplayed his hand. Mark Carney was not an accidental prime minister. The former Bank of Canada governor and Bank of England chief had spent his career managing global crises. But now, in 2025, he faced one that hit home: a hostile trade ultimatum from America. Canada's initial response was calm but firm. "Canada will not accept a bad deal," Carney declared on July 22nd after a closed-door meeting with premiers from Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta. "We want a good deal, not a fast deal." Speaking at a lakeside summit in Muskoka, Carney framed the moment as existential. Trade wasn't just about exports, it was about national sovereignty. The numbers were daunting. The threatened tariffs targeted roughly $43 billion in Canadian exports, including $14 billion in steel, $23 billion in auto parts, and $6 billion in softwood lumber. Over 2.3 million jobs, directly and indirectly tied to these sectors, hung in the balance. But Carney didn't blink. Instead, he went on offense. At a press conference in Prince Edward Island, he reminded Canadians that short-term pain must not dictate long-term strategy. He pointed to the One Canadian Economy Act, Bill C-5, his signature initiative passed just weeks prior, which sought to reduce interprovincial trade barriers and accelerate infrastructure development. The goal? Make Canada less dependent on American logistics and more competitive globally. Action over delay, sovereignty over dependency, he declared. Critics weren't silent. Environmental groups and indigenous organizations accused Carney of sacrificing oversight and consultation in the name of economic autonomy. Protests erupted outside Parliament, but the Prime Minister held his line. No external threat will determine our internal values. Behind closed doors, Canadian negotiators kept communication lines open with U.S. counterparts, but resisted pressure to rush. Leaks from the Prime Minister's office revealed internal modeling showing that even in the worst-case tariff scenario, Canada could survive. GDP might shrink by 2.1%, but diversification efforts, including growing partnerships with the EU and Pacific Rim, offered a cushion. Meanwhile, Canada's media landscape rallied around the theme of resilience. Editorials dubbed the confrontation Canada's moment of steel. Polls showed 68% of Canadians supported the government's hardline approach, even at the risk of short-term economic strain. What made Carney's strategy unique was his reframing of the crisis as an opportunity. He painted Trump's ultimatum as a relic of the past, a zero-sum mindset in a world that had moved on. In his words, "This is not a war between nations. It's a struggle between fear and strategy." And in that reframing, he wasn't just responding to Trump. He was trying to rewrite Canada's role in the North American equation, from loyal sidekick to independent actor. By the final week of July 2025, the world was watching a standoff neither side could easily escape. On one end, Donald Trump, cornered politically, staked his credibility on a threat he couldn't afford to walk back. Backing down would signal weakness to his base. Enforcing the tariff would risk tanking an already fragile economy. On the other end, Mark Carney had tied his legacy to rejecting bad deals and protecting Canadian autonomy. Accepting the U.S. terms would unravel months of policy progress and erode his political capital. Negotiations were ongoing but frozen in spirit. The U.S. wanted quick signatures and concessions. Canada demanded structural fairness and dignity. Each side cited domestic voters as the reason for their intransigence. Each feared the optics of capitulation more than the cost of impasse. Business leaders on both sides began panicking. Canadian firms scrambled for alternative markets. American automakers begged Washington for exemptions. Economists called the looming tariff a lose-lose proposition, with no short-term winners. And yet, no one moved. It was not just a trade dispute anymore. It was a symbolic test of leadership, ideology, and economic vision. The countdown to August 1st was no longer a deadline. It had become a time bomb. For Marcel Leduc, owner of a mid-sized steel processing firm in Hamilton, Ontario, the tariff threat felt like a guillotine swinging above his business. 80% of my output goes to American buyers, he explained. We've built our entire production system around seamless access to the U.S. market. Now, it's chaos. His company employs 132 workers, welders, machinists, engineers, all of whom face uncertain futures. With a 35% tariff looming, several U.S. clients already suspended contracts. They can't absorb those costs, Leduc said. They'll pivot to domestic suppliers or even to Asia. We can't compete with a penalty like that. And Leduc's firm is not an outlier. Across Canada, industries braced for impact. The $14 billion steel sector, $23 billion auto parts supply chain, and $6 billion softwood lumber market found themselves under siege. According to Canadian government estimates, up to 2.3 million jobs, both direct and adjacent, could face disruption if the tariffs go into full effect. The economic modeling is grim. Canada's GDP could shrink by 2.1% in the medium term. Manufacturing centers like Windsor and Sudbury are expected to take major hits. Secondary impacts include declining consumer confidence, investment pullback, and a surge in logistical bottlenecks as firms scramble to reconfigure export routes. In an effort to soften the blow, the federal government accelerated infrastructure spending tied to Bill C-5, aiming to boost domestic resilience. Grants were issued to logistics hubs in Halifax, rail terminals in Edmonton, and new ports in British Columbia, but none of it could come fast enough. Diversification is not a faucet you turn on overnight, said a Quebec-based trade economist. Even with the best-case transition, Canada is going to feel real pain before it sees real alternatives. And while public sentiment remains broadly supportive of Carney's stand, cracks are emerging. In industrial regions, some workers are asking if principle is worth a paycheck. In Youngstown, Ohio, a town that once thrived on steel and auto production, John Miller runs a second-generation auto parts supplier. He never thought much about where the stamped aluminum panels came from. It just showed up, on time, high quality, and fairly priced, he shrugged. But now, we're being told the cost will spike 15% to 20%, and that's before we even talk about delivery delays. The culprit, Trump's tariffs on Canadian inputs. For Miller and thousands like him, the fallout from the July announcement has been swift. Contracts have stalled, suppliers are demanding renegotiations, and downstream clients, auto manufacturers in Detroit, construction firms in Pennsylvania, are signaling budget revisions. According to a report from the Yale Budget Lab, the tariff could slice 0.6% to 0.9% off U.S. GDP, with ripple effects including rising consumer prices up 2.3% and household cost increases between $2,400 to $3,800 per year. Worse still, the manufacturing sector, a core Trump constituency, is bearing the brunt. Production costs are rising, labor hours are being trimmed, and job postings are drying up. Even large firms aren't immune. Home improvement giants like Lowe's and Home Depot, who rely on Canadian timber and steel, have warned shareholders of margin pressure and pricing headwinds. A Home Depot executive privately noted, "Our shelves won't go empty, but our prices are going up." That's a certainty. In politically vulnerable swing states, the backlash is mounting. A coalition of U.S. auto manufacturers, home builders, and consumer goods companies penned an open letter to the White House on July 26th. "We share the desire for strong trade, but this policy is self-harming. It punishes American business more than it protects it." And yet, the administration shows no sign of retreat. Caught between economic logic and political calculation, American consumers now find themselves paying more for less. And small businesses, the supposed backbone of the economy, are left absorbing the shock from a policy they didn't ask for. As one Ohio plant manager put it, "It feels like we're collateral damage in someone else's campaign ad." August 1st looms like a silent hammer. Neither Washington nor Ottawa has blinked. The tariffs are ready. The deals remain unsigned. And what began as a tactical pressure campaign has now hardened into a philosophical divide. Canada stands on principle, prepared to endure economic pain in exchange for long-term autonomy. The U.S., under Trump's direction, has wagered its domestic recovery on confrontation, risking ripple effects through every factory and storefront. Both economies, deeply intertwined, now sit at a precipice. The decisions of the next few days won't just set trade policy. They could redefine the very nature of cross-border cooperation for a generation. The stakes aren't abstract anymore. They're real, measured in lost jobs, higher prices, and frayed trust. In the race to shape the future, will North America win together or fail apart by going it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.